In today's toxic environment, survival isn't just about evading foreign invaders or escaping a corrupt government. Sometimes the biggest threat is escaping internet haters and denying allegations. But in order to be truly effective, you need three things: knowledge, training, and plausible deniability. Now, both your biggest vulnerability and your biggest tool is, of course, going to be your digital trail. I can smell the hate comments from here. The internet trolls are close. Well, I guess now's as good a time as any to stay hydrated, because you know what they say. Hydrate or dihydrate. All right. I think we're in the clear. Obviously, if you're coming up against a well-stocked enemy, you'll need an adequate weapon, and as we've talked about in this series so far, there's no shortage of weird guns out there, but the best tool for internet protection is the sponsor of today's video, Aura. If you've ever been bombarded by spam emails and robocalls, then you probably wonder how these telemarketers get your contact info. I certainly have, and knowing people online can just do that isn't just frustrating, it's kind of scary too. The saying goes, if the product is free, then you're the product. And when you sign up with your email address or phone number, that information is often taken by data brokers and sold off to all sorts of people without your knowledge or consent. They can even find out where you live, where you used to live, and even where your parents live. And while there is a legal process to get yourself removed from these sites and lists, it's often so complicated that a lot of people don't bother. And that's where Aura comes in. Aura is the one-stop shop for internet privacy and security. They issue those takedown requests to an ever-expanding list of data brokers and send you an alert if your info shows up somewhere else. Within my first week of Aura, they issued over 30 different takedown requests, which is insane to think that that many people just have my information and are sharing it with even more. Aura also offers real-time credit and bank monitoring, as well as password management, a VPN service, and 24-hour US-based customer support. If you do find yourself in a cybersecurity pickle, Aura even includes up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. You might already have some form of digital security to lock the virtual door in your private life, but using Aura is like adding a deadbolt and putting up an 8-foot wall with armed guards. To get started today, go to aura.com/brandybuck for a free 14-day trial. Protect yourself from spams, scams, and an inbox overloaded with questionable messages, and enjoy a safer internet experience with Aura. Well guys, we've come to the end of the road, the bottom of the berg, level 8, where only the weirdest and most obscure guns can be found. Now some of these might be familiar to a few of you from rare media appearances, but most, if not all of these, never even made it past the concept stage, let alone the prototype stage. Many were made in extremely small numbers, with possibly only one ever actually being made, and in some cases nothing but a few schematics or partially made mock-ups are all that exist. Also, most of these guns have some of the coolest names on the entire list. Now, as usual, we're going to start off with another shotgun, another arguably space-ish shotgun. As probably one of, if not the first bullpup combat shotgun, the SWAT Triplex 18 was considered to be too far ahead of its time, even though it would go on to inspire guns like the KSG. And putting a picture of the Triplex and the KSG 25 next to each other, you can absolutely see the resemblance. It had twin magazines that used mirror charging handles and dual ejection ports, and was capable of being fired both left and right-handed, and typical of dual-tube shotguns, it could feed off of one at a time or alternate off both. Now, like I said, it was a little too forward-thinking and is now just another one of those cool guns that could have been, with its biggest claim to fame being the inspiration behind the shotgun in Alien Isolation. The Kalashniluger was a homemade project combining the action of a .08 Luger with the furniture of the AK platform. It was designed by Herbert Verla to have a barrel that replaces the upper gas port of the AK and fires through a hole in the front sight mount. So yes, it is essentially just a long-barreled .08 carbine that uses AK furniture, but it's also really fun, and so I had to mention it. The PAPOP combination gun is essentially France's equivalent to the OICW program, combining a bullpup assault rifle with a grenade launcher and a smart targeting system. It was meant to replace the FAMAS, and the first build had a 3-round internal tube magazine for the launcher portion, which ended up being way too heavy, so the second prototype cut down the ammo capacity to 1 and made the overall frame a little bit smaller and lighter. The most unique but also most ridiculous feature of this gun is the camera targeting system, which couples a front-mounted camera under the muzzle to a rotatable video screen on top of the gun that not only allows the shooter to see and shoot over cover or around corners, but it can also interface with the targeting system of the grenades, as well as transmit data to a command post or information center. And while all of that sounds really cool for a sci-fi action concept, it was incredibly overcomplicated because you needed basically an entire network of systems and equipment to use the gun effectively. The NIVA XM1970 was another attempt at a hybrid combination weapon from the 60s designed by the Carl Gustaf company, who wanted to combine a typical assault rifle with the recoilless rifle technology that they're famous for into one weapon. The NIVA program was more or less the Swedish equivalent of the SPIW program, meaning Nytt Infanterivapen, or New Infantry Weapon. The top portion of the weapon was a breech-loaded recoilless launcher, and the bottom section was a bullpup assault rifle, and while everything functioned exactly as they were meant to, the whole thing was, as you can probably imagine, very awkward to use. And like most other similar weapon projects at the time, it was ultimately decided that carrying around a gun with all those extra parts and weight wasn't worth the trouble for how often regular infantry was expected to actually be lobbing ordnance out of the grenade launcher, so while the XM1970 worked fine, it wasn't really worth it in the end. The AK-53 was a Swiss prototype from 1953 that uses a piston-driven blow-forward mechanism that drove the barrel back and forth to cycle the action. This resulted in a low rate of fire that, coupled with the very unconventional design, didn't add up to a great gun, and so SIG quickly scrapped it and moved on. The Bechowiec was a homemade Polish submachine gun built by Henry Strampuch for underground resistance forces. Now obviously, since it was built in secret from scrap parts, it's a very crude design, not helped by the fact that Heinrich wasn't a very experienced gunsmith and had never actually gotten a chance to see how the mechanics of a submachine gun even worked. But all that said, the guns were perfectly functional and had all the necessary features like a safety and a fire selector, and while the gun bears a basic general shape of a typical submachine gun, it actually operates more like a handgun, which uses a slide to operate rather than an enclosed bolt carrier, and it fires from a closed breech with an internal hammer rather than an open breech and a striker. Only about a dozen of these were built before the German presence increased in the area where Strampuch was making them, and so he had to hide or scrap any unfinished guns that hadn't been distributed yet. The Blyskawica, I think,
Blyskawica,
which is Polish for lightning, was another submachine gun made for resistance fighters like the Bechowiec, but it was built a little bit better and produced in wider numbers and used a combination of the Sten and NP40 mechanisms. The last secret Polish submachine gun made under German occupation in World War II was the Choroszmanow, modeled after the Soviet PPD-40 and used by the Tadeusz Kościuszko. It was a Polish resistance group.
Tadeusz Kościuszko.
Typical of small production guns from this time, only a handful are still around today in various museums. The AO-40 was another one of the many bullpup Russian prototypes that used an earlier and cruder hyperburst fire mode that preceded the AN-94. Nearly the entire inner mechanism moved back and forth on the recoil, including the magazine, for 3 rounds before felt recoil on burst mode. The French also had a couple interesting concept weapons, one being the EFAB RFCT, built in the 70s. It uses both caseless and standard 5.56 ammo, and the design was basically an incredibly simplified version of a minigun slapped onto a buttstock, which was neither comfortable to shoot nor very controllable to fire due to excessive recoil and a fire rate of 65 rounds per second. Now, the Reibel machine gun. The Reibel is a very interesting machine gun that was pretty commonly used but is often overshadowed by a lot of more other conventional or recognizable machine guns. The most interesting thing about it is the way ammunition is fed, which is on a side-mounted multi-layer 150-round pan magazine where all of the bullets point towards the center of the round can. That can be mounted on either side of the gun, and the entire action is actually derived from the French FM2429, which itself is based off of the BAR, and the curved pistol grip actually was believed to give a little bit more stability when firing. It was used as a mounted gun on turrets, fortifications, and light armored vehicles, and a later version also made use as an aircraft gun that replaced belts instead of that pan mag. The HGUP 66 looks like the cross between an M16, a Sterling, and one of those early SA-80 prototypes, but it's not really related to any of them. It was one of many one-off prototypes built in the 60s, and it's now held at the ATF National Firearm Collection. Very little is known to the public about its development other than a basic operation, which is typical recoil operation and assumed to use an experimental 5.56 caseless ammunition. Now, this gun would be a perfect weapon for an alternate history sci-fi story, and I'm honestly surprised it hasn't really showed up anywhere. If you've been following the series since the beginning, then you'd know that nearly every gun made in Europe during the late 1800s and early 1900s most likely saw some testing by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but one of the guns to actually see official use was the Salvatore Dormus 1893, also known as the Skoda. It was made by Archduke Karl Salvatore of Austria and Count George von Dormus as a cheaper alternative to the Maxim, and it would actually stay in use from 1893 all the way till 1918. The T-31 was John Garand's attempt to basically bullpup the M1. It borrowed some concepts from the Lewis gun and the FG-42, but it never really went anywhere, and so there wasn't really much development into it. However, the idea of a bullpup M1 Garand is still kind of interesting. The 2BA-40 was one of several failed contenders to the Kalashnikov design in the latter half of the 1900s. There's very little information out on it, but it's assumed to have been made in both an assault rifle and a light machine gun variant, similar to the RPK and the AKM. A similarly obscure gun out of Bolivia was the Ingram FBM assault rifle. It combined the action of the Galil and the Stoner, but it's not actually known if one was ever actually made, even though it did see some initial design concepts. Only one unconfirmed picture is all that might actually exist of this gun. An even more obscure gun is the EFAB 5.56, which was a crude, homemade submachine gun made with pipes and scrap metal that used revolver grips. It was confiscated by Colombian police, so it was most likely a one-off made by some sort of criminal. Now, one gun that I've always been a little bit curious about for years, and is probably one of the first guns that kind of sparked my whole interest in the unique and interesting guns, is the Saritch 308 bullpup. This gun showed up in the early 2010s as a sort of new age concept Russian assault rifle. It was featured in a few different video games from the 2010s, but there hasn't really been any more development or word on it since. Now, the whole idea of a bullpup rifle has been around since at least the 1940s, and one of the earliest guns that was a somewhat successful, or at least physically produced bullpup, was the Knorr-Bremse. This early bullpup was made as a contender to the FG-42, and records of its design have been lost, and most of the internal parts were missing when it was found after the war, so we don't actually really even know how it worked. We just know that it existed. Also, I'm just now realizing how many guns on this level are all bullpups, so I'm sorry about that. But the next gun is the Reinmetall RH-70. This was one of several prospective replacements to the G3 designed in the 70s. Its most unique feature is that the magazine slots through the back of the grip, forming what is sort of like a thumbhole. Otherwise, it's just another Cold War bullpup rifle that never really went anywhere. And speaking of which, the Interdynamics MKR was also a prototype bullpup that never went anywhere, but this one was designed by Swedish company Interdynamics AB, and if you think this looks like a precursor to a Keltec, that's because it was. George Kellgren designed the MKR as one of the first micro-caliber carbines that fired rounds like 5mm RFM, 22 Magnum, or the gun's proprietary 5.4 MKR that was basically just a 22 Magnum necked down to 4.5 and fired solid copper bullets. Unfortunately, the gun wasn't expected to be very effective or popular, and so it and the 5.4 MKR cartridge never saw any serious production. Now, we all know that for every few gems, there's bound to be a dud every now and then, and even the German space wizards at H&K have made a few stinkers. Like the HK-36, which was introduced as a small caliber follow-up to their battle rifles to contend with the M16. But we all know that H&K was definitely on that pack during the Cold War, because the HK-36 does not use traditional 5.56 ammunition, and rather than make a conventional rifle and call it a day, H&K instead decided to make an entirely new cartridge called 4.6 Spoon Point that had a chunk of the lead shaved off at an angle on the tip of the bullet, with the idea being that this would tumble better upon hitting a target and thus have better stopping power despite being a smaller round. And if you're wondering how well that worked, just look at how many guns around fire 4.6 Spoon Point. I'll wait. While the first design of the gun used the standard concept of a detachable box magazine, they decided for some reason that that wasn't good enough and rebuilt it with a fixed magazine that you would pop open a loading door on to load prepared 30-round boxes in a method somewhat similar to, and I hate that I'm making this comparison, the Krag-Jorgensen. This very unique loading mechanism was conceived as a simpler and easier way to load a gun, because apparently that's too complicated. And if you're wondering how well that actually worked, just look at how many guns are around today that use a fixed magazine with a pop-open loading door. While it bears superficial resemblance to the later G36, they are not similar in function nor directly related, and in my mind, there is no way that H&K called the G36 the G36 to mask the fact that they made this stupid gun. Now, we've covered quite a few interesting palm pistols from the late 1800s and early 1900s in this series, and while a few used very interesting designs that didn't see any long-standing use, I've been saving this last one for now because, oh boy. The McCarty Revolver was, in very basic terms, a protector palm pistol scaled up for much larger rounds and adapted to fire with a more conventional grip and trigger. Why they couldn't just make it a normal revolver, I don't know, but rather than a cylinder or box magazine, it uses a flat circular disc cassette thing. As you can probably expect, this was considered a weird and unnecessary design even in its own time, and only one is confirmed to still be around, if indeed more than one was even made. Now, we've talked about a lot of very interesting grenade launchers on this list, some using computers to fire, some using some very creative or unique launching mechanism, but one of the weirdest, stupidest, and also funniest examples is the Kresimir, which just uses blank rounds to lob live hand grenades out of the barrel. Basically, it's a sort of mishmash Soviet hillbilly version of those soda can AR-15 launchers. Basically, all the action is a shortened AK magazine that shoots blank rounds that interfaces with a secondary magazine loaded with, again, live hand grenades that feed into the loading mechanism and then use the blank round to set off the grenade and launch it out the barrel. It uses an absolutely massive side-mounted lever to run the action because you need a whole lot of leverage to actually move all the internals and load the thing. But the biggest problem is that if you get a light strike or have a bad blank, then you have a live grenade cooking in the action of this gun that only has a 5-second fuse, and so you better be able to run really fast. Ian McCollum of Forgotten Weapons refers to the Kresimir as one of the most bonkers weapons out there, and that assessment is incredibly fitting. Now, do you guys want to talk about another late World War II bullpup concept rifle? Good, because the SREM one was a British bullpup rifle designed in the later half of World War II, whose initials mean Sniper Rifle Experimental Model. It uses a very unique form of pump action where you actually run the entire pistol grip back and forth to cycle rounds. The gun obviously never made it out of the concept stage and certainly was never put into any sort of production, but it has made a single media appearance as of the filming of this video as one of the default weapons in Sniper Elite 5. Another goofy sniper rifle is the Knight's Armament revolver rifle built off of a heavily modified Ruger Super Red Hawk. It was made as a mid-range survival rifle and used an internally suppressed barrel, which is very rare for revolvers because of gas escaping between the cylinders and the breech. So to get around this, a small sleeve in each cylinder chamber slides forward when firing, sealing off the gap. A different sniper rifle that allegedly saw some use in the war was the Schalldampfer Karabiner, which just means silenced carbine. As the story goes, U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel James Atwood recovered the rifle in the 60s from the former home of Graf von Helldorf, a prominent Nazi officer and police chief of Berlin, who was one of the conspirators to kill Hitler in Operation Valkyrie. As basically the German equivalent of the Delisle carbine, the SDK fires 9mm rounds through an internally suppressed barrel using a bolt-action mechanism. And in another timeline, this gun very well could have been the one to take out the evil mustache man. If any of that were true at all, since Atwood was not just a military officer and history enthusiast, he was also a grifter and con man known for making up stories to sell fake Nazi memorabilia. Now, the gun does indeed exist, and at least 2 are confirmed to have been made, but they were custom jobs made by a Berlin gunsmith on special order by Atwood himself, who first tried to sell them to the CIA before making up the whole Nazi assassination device story to get an unsuspecting private collector to buy one. Now, one of those 2 rifles, I'm not exactly sure which one, now resides in the National Infantry Museum in Georgia, so if you're ever in the area, take a look at it and tell them I sent you. We all know that over the years there have been plenty of wacky pieces out of the Slavic countries, and plenty of gunsmiths in the Soviet Union were trying basically every idea that came to their mind. The most aggressively Russian concept would of course be to make a vodka-fueled pistol, but that would be ridiculous, right? The Gurevich silent revolver was a sabotage and espionage weapon developed in 1943. Rather than a suppressor or even the weird piston rounds used by the OTS and PPS, the Gurevich uses a liquid propellant made of ethanol and glycerin to provide just enough power while still remaining subsonic. It actually did use a similar concept to those piston rounds, and in a lot of ways could even be considered a predecessor to the idea, but it also is, in a way, a hydraulic-fired pistol. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but the actual projectile is much smaller than the overall cartridge, since the balance of size and weight is crucial to actually making the entire thing work. Around 50 were contracted to be made for special purpose military operations, but the war ended before the project went through, and the Soviets abandoned the idea shortly after. Now, the last gun for level 8 is one I'm sure some of you have heard of and were probably wondering if I'd mention, and that is, of course, the Hellreigel. Almost nothing is known about it other than what you can deduce by looking at the right side of the gun, since a couple photographs showing it from that side are all that still exist of it. It's believed to have been a water-cooled, drum-fed prototype submachine gun from sometime around World War I. It was presumably tested in the Austro-Hungarian military as a sort of small-caliber squad automatic weapon or walking fire gun meant for sustained fire, as implied by the water cooling shroud over the barrel, the large drum magazines, and the 2-man team photographed in the test trial. What actually happened to it and where it ended up is a complete mystery that has intrigued history buffs and gun aficionados for years, mostly because we have no real idea how it worked or performed and can only speculate from the few photographs and scribbled notes that exist from it. And with that, we've come to the very bottom of my original list of unique, interesting, and wacky firearms on the Weird Gun Iceberg. I want to thank everyone for all the support and the kind words over the last year. It's really helped keep me going, because there were times where researching some of these guns was a bit of a slog, but knowing that I had thousands of people waiting to hear about them was a pretty good incentive. Since I will likely be hitting 10,000 subscribers now that this video is out, I've thought it would be fun to do one last bonus video about some of the other weird guns you all mentioned in the comments as a bit of a thank you. After that, I'll be taking the channel in a bit of a different direction, diving more into some cool bits of history and talking about some neat stories from fiction, but rest assured I will still be talking about guns every opportunity I can. My next big video project is going to be about Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, which is a really neat bit of American history that I feel like a lot of people have heard about but don't really know about, and so I took a trip to San Antonio to revisit some of the actual places their story happened so I can tell you what happened. If that all sounds interesting, stick around and subscribe if you haven't so that you don't miss out. And if you want to up your cybersecurity game, check out Aura, and if you want to up your energy game, check out Dubby. Links for both of them will be in the comments. Thank you all again, and goodbye, everyone.